Hello and welcome to Newsfire with me, Ayza Omar. Now, they've already been called the Iron Brothers, friends in times of distress. China and Pakistan relationship has been strong all this while. And once again, we see as President Alvi of Pakistan visits China on the invitation of President Xi Jinping for a 2-day visit, as a support that Pakistan shows China at this very difficult time during the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus that took China by storm. But now, as trends are showing, as the World Health Organization is going ahead and saying time and again that China has very successfully stopped this epidemic in its tracks. Also, what we're looking to investigate in this part of the show is what exactly is China doing right in stopping the virus and how it's helping Pakistan at this very critical time when the virus has become a pandemic and it's spread all over the world. So without further ado, let me introduce who we will be speaking to. First off, we have with us a journalist based out of Beijing, Ms. Zoon Ahmed Khan. She will be joining us here for this conversation. Also, we have with us Mr. Mustafa the Executive Director of the Pakistan-China Institute. He's joining us today from Islamabad. Let's start with you, Ms. Zoon, especially since you're there, you're in the heart of all this development happening, President Alvi's visit to China at this point. It's not just on Twitter that we're hearing all this sense of gratitude from citizens of China on how they really appreciate at this time the support coming from Pakistan. But give us a better understanding of how he's being received at this point.
Well, obviously, Ayza, as you mentioned rightly, this is a very critical period for China. I mean, these past 8 weeks, most of us have been following major restrictions. And at this time of need and relative difficulty, whichever friends of China, whichever of them choose to show support or express their gratitude and also, I mean, in tangible terms, give support to the Chinese people are being very warmly received. So President Arif Alvi's visit at this time definitely has been very warmly welcomed. I know that Chinese media all over the country have also personally reached out to me and many other Pakistanis to comment, to give insight. The Chinese people are also immensely grateful for the help that Pakistani people sent when the coronavirus was very badly hit in the country. And I think this period, I mean, the fact that President Arif Alvi is coming at this period when, even though China is recovering, but still the wounds are healing, the people are still going through a difficult period, is going to go a long way. And I'll also add that I've been in this country for almost 5 years, and the way the Chinese feel about Pakistan, the way they feel about the term Batiye, Iron Brothers, it's actually very deeply ingrained in their social thinking, in their attitude towards Pakistanis. And the Pakistani president coming to China has been a big headline. It's been a big boost to the Chinese people. It's been trending on all of the social media. You mentioned Twitter, but actually there are various Chinese social media that young people and otherwise people use, which are talking about this visit. And I'm very glad that the timing has been so critical, has been very good, because it's a time when the Chinese people truly need to feel supported.
Now, is this the first senior political leader from any state around the world who's making this visit to China?
Actually, it's not. There were other leaders as well, like Mongolia, for example. Other Far East leaders have also visited China in this critical period, but it is one of the first. And of course, given the special relationship between China and Pakistan, and given that Pakistan is a fairly significant country in the world in terms of geopolitics, we know that Pakistan is a very important country for the region as well. It is a significant visit, even if it's not the first. And it's gotten a lot of attention.
It's gotten a lot of attention. Now, the World Health Organization has talked about this, especially in recent days. They've said that what China has done has really broken what should have been an epidemic curve on an exponential rise, has broken that curve, has done some strategies right. Now, China is also helping Pakistan in dealing with the outbreak as a number of cases slowly but gradually are increasing here. Tell us a little about how is that help being translated in terms of advice or monetary help?
So, well, firstly, Ayza, I think I'd like to say a bit about what China went through. It didn't just take the government's policies, which were extremely decisive and timely, but it was also the discipline of the people that allowed for the result that we see. definitely the Chinese people and foreigners in China as well. I mean, there are so many people from all over the world that are residents of this country. They took this very seriously. They knew that they have to be responsible citizens and responsible residents in this critical period. So in terms of the cooperation now, I mean, we see that the numbers have gone down to single digit, which is massive, given that just weeks ago, we were seeing hundreds of deaths per day being recorded. Today, that number has stabilized, but still, we know that when people will come back to their cities, it may spike up. So people are still extremely cautious. That said, now what help can China give Pakistan? Number one, China has already, sent masks and medical supplies, medical equipment. We know that under CPEC, under the Belt and Road, there was already scientific and academic cooperation, and the experts that have been sent from China are actually working with Pakistanis, not only in coronavirus, but also in the locust issue that we are facing. So that's another area of cooperation that both countries are working on. This is going to be extremely tangible and beneficial for China and other countries in the world, because through its confidence in the measures, China has given a roadmap of what can work. And that's something the whole world has to. Initially, it was receiving immense criticism for these measures. And today, people are telling their governments to follow the Chinese roadmap. And I think that speaks volumes in itself.
Zoon, I think you've hit these very key points that I want to take this conversation further on. Mr. Mustafa Hyder Sayed, tell us a little about how you feel about how China took these measures, initially being criticized around the world for being very drastic, for the kind of isolation it created amongst its citizens, and the self-discipline that citizens showed themselves. This kind of strategy succeeded. Now that they're helping Pakistan, tell us a little about how you view these being employed here.
Ayza, firstly, the Chinese people were facing two onslaughts. One was from the humanitarian angle, from the coronavirus, COVID-19. And the second was a political onslaught internationally. And so they had to deal with two crises at the same time, simultaneously. So I think they have survived both the crises very well and very successfully. And they have proved both the geopolitical onslaught and the racism which they faced, as well as the health disaster in the form of COVID-19 very well. And as Zoon mentioned, that the discipline, in my view, was triangular. The discipline and the challenge and the containment of the COVID-19. I think that it was the people, the Communist Party of China, which is the biggest, largest political party in the world, boasting a membership of 90 million people. And then, of course, the State Council, which is the administrative executive body of China, working in harmony to deal with this pandemic of a magnitude which has not been seen in recent history. And bearing in mind that China is in so many different units, there are different provinces, there are autonomous regions, there are different ethnicities, there are minorities. It's a very diverse country. And unifying all of these areas and countries and borders and fighting as one, and also then effectively containing it and then eliminating the COVID-19. And now they have come to a stage where they are helping other countries which are facing COVID-19 is certainly remarkable. And I think we ought to learn a lesson or two from the governance style of China and how they were able to successfully fight it off, whereas the rest of the world is still grasping and struggling with different strategies, and also in some areas, some countries have failed in containing it.
You talk about the rest of the world here. It's ironic, I feel, in a way that while there's so much to learn from a country that's not only seen the worst of the virus, but also successfully and very quickly got hold of it and sort of stopped the growth. But it's ironic that countries in the West are right now criticizing and coming up with conspiracy theories of who's responsible for this, and it being biological warfare.
So I think that when you talk about Western countries, firstly, we can't help but notice the tweet of President Trump, which is calling the COVID-19 a China virus. So I think before we even call it bioweapons, I think the racist slurs and the propaganda, information warfare which we are seeing is very, very unfortunate and unwarranted, wherever it comes from, because this is a time where we need to put prejudices and biases aside, where we need to put politics aside and come together as a human race to fight this virus, which has no face, which has no ethnicity, which has no religion, which has no border. It could have emanated from very well anywhere. And we need to, and I think in SARC, I think Pakistan played a very good and positive role where we participated on the invitation of India to put politics aside and make a collective strategy to fight this virus. And I think that's what other countries need to do, Ayza. As far as warfare is concerned, I think we have to have evidence-based assertions, and there have been assertions coming from different areas. But I think that all of those assertions have yet to be substantiated. So I don't think we should jump to conclusions and point fingers to anyone at this point in time. From my basic understanding, this is came from animals and from the news reports that we've seen so far. And it's not anyone's responsibility, and it's no country's responsibility, and we can't blame anyone. We really need to tackle the issue because, to be frank, whether it's Pakistan or neighboring countries like Iran, the magnitude of the problem is just increasing, and there's a chance that before the virus spreads, the panic is actually causing a lot of issues within the people, within the civil society, and people don't know what to do. So I think we really need to come together right now as a society, as a nation, and as a human race to sort of tackle this problem and take it head on.
Very good point there. Time to focus really on how to tackle the virus and not on politicizing it. Coming back to you, Zoon, now during this visit, President Arif Alvi, as we understand, is also going to be meeting President Xi Jinping. And also on the agenda are certain MOUs that they might be signing. Can you shed some light onto this?
Okay, what I can say right now is that obviously some of the pressing issues that both countries are trying to address, as Mustafa rightly mentioned, as you rightly pointed out, are the coronavirus, the immediate pressing cooperation that we need, and obviously the local infestation. Because as we all know, that China-Pakistan Economic Corridor has transitioned from a phase 1 to a phase 2, where agriculture cooperation and special economic zones and business interests, I mean, all of these are areas of mutual interest. So I think the first priority during this visit is also to fine-tune and really, figure out the final shape of the cooperation for these two pressing concerns, but then also to further enhance the phase 2, which would mean how can Pakistan increase the demand of its exports in the Chinese market, and also how can Pakistan attract businesses more effectively. So these are definitely the priority areas that both sides have already identified. And I would also like to add, I mean, we just had a very interesting conversation, Mustafa. Whatever Mustafa said about this blame game, I couldn't agree more. But I also want to add that, interestingly, the kind of criticism coming towards China with respect to the coronavirus, I mean, this is a country seeing hundreds of people dying on a daily basis, and the racism that came out of it also played a role in uniting the Chinese people. It really did strengthen them a bit that, we need to stick together at this crisis period. And I think it says a lot about the Chinese mindset that after having gone through this difficult period, they're happy, not just happy, but keen to support and help all the countries. Some of them that were previously very critical of China's own policies, which turned out to be successful. The Chinese people and the Chinese government are both trying their best to help all of the countries, including the United States, including countries in the European Union, including countries in other parts of Asia and Africa. They're doing everything that they can to help and support. And that said, I mean, we still haven't solved the problem completely here. So I think this is something that we should learn immensely from. The virus, I mean, the American president saying that the virus is a Chinese virus is something that definitely can hurt the bigger agenda, the bigger purpose, that humanity definitely needs to unite against the virus with no ideology. It is serving, in a sense, it's serving to unite us. So I really hope that the world can see through the kind of biases that seem to trend and that seem to, disunite and divide people, and we realize that we have bigger issues. After the virus, we have the environment, we have security concerns, we have the refugee crisis we are all facing collectively. So this experience, I hope, as tragic as it is, it can help us think and empathize with each other.
There's definitely silver lining there. I'm really glad you highlighted those points because they're critical here. Well, Ms. Zoon, thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Mustafa, coming back to you here, the silver lining that Ms. Zoon pointed out very eloquently, because the world is seeing an overall economic slowdown, not only just because of the corona outbreak, but as the consequent result of the oil prices having dropped and that price war going on. But just with China and Pakistan, there's a huge CPEC, the Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor involved, and President Alvi visiting China right now could be boosting, once again, that slumped economy.
Ayza, I think that's a great way of putting it. And I think Pakistan has a lot going for it at this point in time, despite the coronavirus, et cetera, and the oil prices, because there's a large amount of Chinese investment which continues to come into Pakistan. And when you asked Zoon about what exactly is going to be happening this time in CPEC, according to our information, and as you know, the Pakistan-China Institute has been producing a lot of path-breaking research on CPEC. There are two areas which we believe will be accentuated further in this visit of President Alvi to China. One is the fine-tuning of the working group on agriculture. So there's a joint working group in this China-Pakistan Economic Corridor on agriculture. But its terms and the cooperation and what it's going to be looking like in terms of research and then agricultural produce is going to be fine-tuned in this visit. And the second is a new working group on science and technology is going to be established on how China and Pakistan can cooperate on science and technology and how can there be transfer of technology in terms of innovation and research and development that China has done, and how Pakistan can follow suit and also establish some institutes where science and technology is focused on in Pakistan. So these are two areas which I believe will be of immense focus. And apart from that, I think that when this government came, there were a lot of questions as to what will happen to CPEC. And I think this visit reaffirms the commitment of the government to the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And we see that as we speak, there are immense projects happening, which are not only brick and mortar, but they are actually people-friendly and people-oriented projects. And $1 billion have been given for grants in water supply and clean water projects, vocational training institutes, schools, Medicare, scholarships for young Pakistanis aspiring to study abroad in China. So there's $1 billion for that. And then in Gwadar, the biggest airport of Pakistan is being built. As we speak, it's being constructed. And a 300 megawatt power plant in Gwadar is being established. Gwadar is a place that before CPEC, a lot of Pakistanis had never even heard about, let alone visited. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of things happening in terms of projects and then in terms of vocational training and capacity building of the workforce of the Pakistani people. There are vocational training centers being established. One, of course, is in Gwadar. And then we have the industrial zones. As Zoon mentioned, the second phase of CPEC includes industrial zones, which will increase our exports and relocate Chinese industries who are facing high levels of costs of production in China to Pakistan. And there are three major SEZs, which I think will also get a boost from President Alvi's visit. One is in Nowshera, next to Nowshera and Rashakai, which is being conducted by the China Road and Bridge Corporation. The second is on M3 in Punjab, the Allama Iqbal Industrial Park, as it's called now. And the number third is the Dhabeji, which is outside of Karachi and Sindh. So all three provinces are being covered within these industrial zones. And I think that will also be reiterated.
His trip to China at this critical time once again reinforces not just the friendly relations between China and Pakistan, but those massive projects that are development projects mostly that have been going on in Pakistan, gives them boost and encouragement. Well, Mr. Mustafa, Hyder, Syed, thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. And at this point, let me welcome another guest. We have with us Mr. Andrew K.P. Leung, the chairman of Andrew Leung International Consultants and an international independent China strategist. You're joining us from Hong Kong. Welcome to Newswire. The conversation essentially is, and it's a question I want to put to you, in retrospect, in hindsight, later on, maybe in a few weeks, maybe in a few months, right now, the hysteria, once it's died down, will the world be able to see what China has done to fight COVID-19 and how it's offered to help countries around it, like Pakistan, in taking the same steps?
Well, actually, the relationship between China and Pakistan is very unique. It is really termed by both sides as a cast iron relationship, all-weather friends. And this is exemplified by this huge project, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which of course is part of China's global Belt and Road Initiative. But however, in recent months, there has been a lot of headwind against the Belt and Road projects from other countries. I think that at the moment, the whole world is gripped by this coronavirus crisis, which is, I think, is quite likely to spread to Pakistan in a big way, if not already. And then a lot of countries are extremely worried. And even European countries like Serbia, the president of Serbia recently expressed the hope that perhaps China could lend a helping hand. And of course, Italy is already being assisted at the request of Italy. So I think that the joint kind of efforts to combat this coronavirus threat is also very important. And in fact, if you link the two together, the Belt and Road could well be turned into a kind of connected Belt and Road against the coronavirus. This could be an antivirus global Belt and Road.
But let me ask you this then. I mean, the efforts being made not only by invitation but by offers, what China has done for Pakistan. Just in a snapshot, 12,000 kits have been donated, 300,000 masks have been given. In fact, 10,000 protective suits and $4 million to build hospitals. And not to forget to mention here that a test kit has been established with the Wuhan University and a local university here in Pakistan. But this is a relationship that has seen many storms and has been just gotten stronger with time. But China's relationship with the West, is this an opportunity to see a reset? An opportunity to start again, maybe afresh?
I think this is, you're quite right. I mean, this is the watershed moment in the whole world, in the world order. A watershed moment highlighted by you're seeing the financial markets around the world, and money doesn't solve the problem. I mean, even if you throw money at the issues, the issues are unlikely to be resolved. And then there are a lot of global issues like the health, virus issues, environmental sustainability, climate change, all these issues, and also the relief of poverty, the empowerment of the people, the capacity building for countries to grow their economy and grow their own abilities to sustain the economy is very, very important. And of course, the part of the equation is infrastructural connectivity. Because without infrastructural connectivity, you can't carry your products from one place to another within the same country. You can't exploit the productivity potential of this country. So I think that this is a rare moment in the world when everything seems to be upended. You can see that advanced countries are still struggling with how to cope with the virus. And you can see that markets are being rattled and then and throwing tons and tons of paper money at the problem doesn't resolve the issue. And of course, developing countries have their own problems as well, not least of which is their health, education, infrastructure.
But I like what you said there, Mr. Andrew, that this is a watershed moment and it's a great opportunity for reset of international relations with China. Well, thank you for joining us here on Newswire. With this, we'll take a quick short break. We'll be back to discuss the power vacuum in Iraq and what that is doing to all the militias reorganizing themselves. Welcome back to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. We are going to be discussing the power vacuum in Iraq and how this could possibly affect the dynamics there, considering that it's been over 5 months that protests have been taking place, where protesters are demanding an overhaul of what they call a corrupt political system. Now, there had been quite a mess in recent weeks, especially since the nominated premier was rejected by all parties, especially by protesters. However, the March 16th deadline, it seemed, had just crossed without the president appointing a new premier. But this news has just come in today that a new name has been given for the position by the president. And this is a former Najaf governor, Mr. Adnan al-Zurfi, who is been named as the new premier. Now, of course, we're also going to look at something that has been developing in Iraq in these days, and that is concerning the U.S. bases there. Now, there has been news coming in that following the attacks, the recent rocket attacks on U.S. bases, the U.S. announced that they will be moving their troops. So what does that essentially mean when the U.S. is moving out of the 8 bases that they have, 3 of them they're moving out of? So does this mean that they are trying to reduce their footprint in Iraq? All this and more we'll be discussing. Let me introduce who we have with us as us. First off, we have from Istanbul, Mr. Mathew Bryza, former ambassador, joining us on this conversation. And also we have with us Mr. Akeel Abbas. He is a professor at the American University in Iraq, and he's joining us from Suleimania. Welcome to both of you. Mr. Mathew Bryza, of course, there's a huge conversation waiting to happen with you about the U.S. troops. But first off, I must get to the point here about the new appointee who has been named by the president of Iraq. There's a lot going on in the Twitter sphere, not just social forums, on who this person is. What is your understanding of his alliances, his loyalties, and a little about Mr. al-Zurfi?
Sure. My understanding is, first of all, he previously worked for the provisional government, so the organization that the U.S. put in place after the Second Iraq War. So therefore, I would assume he has pretty good relations with Washington, number one. Number two, he previously headed the parliamentary group of former Prime Minister al-Abadi. So he's obviously deeply connected to national politics, as well as you described, Ayza. He's a former governor of Najaf, which is such an important province and such an important region for pilgrimages and in general for Iraqi society. So he seems like he is a dynamic and capable person. He's only 54 years old. I'd like to think that's still young. And he seems so far to be somebody who is not suffering from the sort of political opposition that the previous nominee had faced.
Interesting, definitely. What do you think? Is he going to face any kind of criticism in terms of his loyalties? Because Mr. Alawi saw a very quick exit, being called pro-Iranian, something protesters completely rejected the idea of. What about Mr. al-Zurfi?
Okay, well, I mean, Mr. Adnan al-Zurfi, one would call him the second generation of this ruling class. Historically speaking, he has been associated with the Dawah Party, and then he broke away from it, and he developed more of a pragmatic approach to politics. And good relationship with the Americans. I agree with what you guys said, and also in his governing experience in Najaf, has shown himself a strong leader. He stood up for the Sadrists, which was huge at the time. But I think over the years he developed, I would say, a good understanding of how the state operates, how the state functions. He has been a player in it, and I think he's going to use some of his expertise. It is known that he is anti the pro-Iran militias in Iraq, these armed groups that are part of the Iraqi state but do not actually function as part of that state. So he has declared positions in terms of supporting the protesters. The fact that he has been nominated for the premiership says something about this political class, that this political class has accepted to make a concession. I don't think in a situation other than this, Mr. Adnan al-Zurfi would have a chance at this. The bigger political leaders would have objected, but they do understand now that this is an exceptional situation. They have to give something to the protest movement, to the street. The Iraqi street has lost all confidence in this political class. And if he can balance out some of the vested interests of this political class while implementing some of the reforms that the protesters have asked for, including an early exit from this current political deadlock through early elections. If he manages to do this, if he manages to rein in the militias, if he manages to organize an early election that is credible, I think he would have achieved a feat. If he can do this, I think he can if he has some alliances within this current political class, which seems he has, but we still have to wait and see how things will pan out at the end.
Right. So his work is definitely cut out for him here. Mr. Bryza, coming to you here, analysts are saying he is a very pro-American nominee and that he has that kind of history. But we saw Mr. Mohammad Alawi being rejected by the protesters because he was pro-Iranian, because of his connections, because of his loyalties. Considering that very recently that the Iraqi government had passed a non-binding resolution calling for all U.S. and coalition troops to move out of Iraq, how long do you think before the protesters speak up against this candidate?
Well, it depends on how much he's seen as being, I think, pro-Iranian, because I think while the point you made is that there was an upsurge of anti-American sentiment after the killing of al-Soleimani on Iraqi territory, I think that's quieted down. And I even saw a report this morning in the Washington Post of another Shiite militia leader in Iraq who supposedly has quietly said it's okay if U.S. troops stay for a while. So I think that anti-U.S. sentiment was an emotional response in the heat of the moment back in January. And so my guess is that al-Zurfi's good ties with the United States probably are not going to be such a liability, not in the same way that al-Alawi's ties to Iran were seen as a liability. In other words, what I'm trying to say is I think the underlying political, emotional currents among Iraqi society, among the protesters, is more distrustful of Iran than of the United States at this point.
That's a really good point there. Mr. Abbas, coming to you on this, is it really the sentiment on the ground? Do you feel that right now there are more suspicions towards, or the sentiment is more hostile towards pro-Iranian forces than it is towards pro-American?
The Iraqi street has developed more negative sentiments towards the Iranians than towards the Americans. That's correct. I didn't hear you clearly. I assume that is your question. If so, I agree. I agree with what your guest also said. I don't think anti-Americanism is deep in Iraq. It is more of an ideological trend in thinking. Basically, the pro-Iran forces in Iraq, the Sadrists, are known for their anti-American position. But the Iraqi street, particularly the Shia street, over the last 6 months, I would say, over the last 7-8 months, since the summer of last year, all the way through the protest movement, and the protest movement has been significant in this regard. The Iraqi street, the Shia street, has turned against the militias, the pro-Iran militias. It's really a big, turning point because of the role of these militias in suppressing the protesters. So they really have lost a lot. And as a consequence of this, the anti-Iran sentiments are on the rise in the Iraqi street. This is one thing. The other political forces in Iraq, Sunnis, Kurds, and a good segment of the Shias, of the Shia political forces, do actually want the American troops to stay. The only faction in Iraqi politics that wants the Americans out are the pro-Iran crowd, and to a certain extent the Sadrists. But even the Sadrists have walked back from their earlier position about targeting the Americans if they don't leave Iraq. So I think on balance, I don't see the U.S. getting out of Iraq anytime soon. The Americans are only taking the steps to consolidate their presence in fewer bases in Iraq that are easy for them to defend. But I don't see them leaving Iraq, and I think there is enough of an Iraqi political will to have them stay.
Okay, so here, in fact, on that point, let me introduce another guest who's just joining us. We have with us Professor Dr. Christian Kaunert. He's the Chair of Policing and Security, as well as Director of the Informational Centre for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. He's joining us from Cardiff, UK. Welcome to this conversation. Essentially, we're looking at the political scenario right up to the new premier that's just been announced today, Mr. Adnan al-Zurafi. And before that, the former candidate, Mohammad Alawi, he was nominated. He withdrew his nomination papers, in fact, and he talked about how the political parties were not interested in establishing what the protesters were demanding. The kind of political scenario on the ground that Mr. al-Zurafi is going to be facing. What are the biggest challenges right now that he's looking at?
I think there's very, very severe challenges, of course, that we're dealing with in the region. Of course, the very, very significant challenge that we are dealing with at the moment is the political and potentially military tension between the United States and Iran, of course, signified by the earlier killings, the very significant security threat that has been interjected also with the Corona crisis. And of course, Iran has been very, very significantly affected in that. And now we see this spreading very, very globally, including in the United States. We see a lot of services being pared back. So we see a very volatile situation with a number of different security threats as they come in. And in that situation, we also have a very significantly unstable political situation within the country, which is, of course, something that is of concern and as such is something that the government will need to tackle.
Is Professor Kaunert, in your opinion, the anti-US sentiment something that he will be facing any difficulty in handling? That is, if it even exists to that extent, considering that the US is also making moves to withdraw their troops from at least 3 out of the 8 bases it has in Iraq?
Yes, I mean, increasingly the United States is withdrawing because, of course, the political mood is such that it is increasingly less safe and less secure to be there. And, of course, the United States is kind of looking at that. It was a conflict that the United States has been wanting to withdraw already for a number of months and in fact, for a while. But, of course, this kind of transition process of starting to implement withdrawal and where are the troops going to go, and all of that makes it a complicated situation because, of course, during that time, there are still potential targets, and we've seen a number of those events as well.
All right, coming back to you, Mr. Bryza, similarly on this point, the U.S. coalition, they haven't yet disclosed the timetable of troop movements, obviously for security concerns. But is this repositioning happening because of the recent rocket attacks? Is this because, as Professor Kaunert even pointed out, it is becoming too unsafe for their troops to be on the ground there?
I think the answer is yes and no. Yes, because indeed the timing right now is clear that this is an attempt to consolidate the U.S. military presence in bases, larger ones that are easier to defend than the Al-Taji base that was attacked twice in recent days. But my understanding from my friends in Washington is that this sort of repositioning had actually been planned for the past several months as a result of the fight against ISIS beginning to wind down in Iraq. So there still is a need for the U.S. military presence, at least in terms of the way U.S. military commanders view it, because the goal is not simply to destroy the caliphate, so-called caliphate of so-called Islamic State, but the goal was to destroy the movement. And so U.S. military commanders believe that's going to take some more time. The 5,000 U.S. troops that are in Iraq, their main mission is to train the elite Iraqi counterterrorist forces that will carry this fight to the remnants of ISIS. And while, as Dr. Kaunert in Wales said, it has been the desire of President Trump to pull all U.S. troops out of the Middle East, again, as I said a moment ago, I think his military commanders are arguing the opposite. They're saying the fight is not done. The movement of ISIS is still out there, and the U.S. needs to remain on the ground, just in easier to protect bases.
Mr. Abbas, I was asking, do you feel that finally that political chaos has come to an end here with Adnan al-Zurafi as the new PM? and that the U.S. forces are not going anywhere anytime soon?
I think there is an inclination, a tendency among political analysts in Iraq to see it this way. There is a fatigue, really a significant, big fatigue from all of this. Has been months without a full government, and I think the intention now is to come to some sort of a closure regarding this current political scene, organize an early election, and figure out what we should do with the U.S., figure out what we should do about the militias. Because really the challenges are these.
The challenges indeed. Mr. Akeel Abbas, thank you for joining us. Professor Dr. Kaunert, and of course, Mr. Mathew Bryza, thank you for being part of this conversation on Newswire, where we were looking at the political chaos in Iraq and whether it has come to an end or not. Unfortunately, we've run out of time and it's come to the end of the program. We will be seeing you tomorrow with more news and analysis. Till then, stay safe and we'll see you then. Goodbye.